That's me in Spokane with a bunch of people who were giving out free hugs. The entire city of Spokane was ready for DIR floor time that day, so I asked if I could take a picture. This is a lecture that I gave from my hotel room in Spokane to Oakwood Academy in Toronto. The folks at Oakwood Academy are really experienced floor timers. They're working really hard and do great work in a school setting, which is not always the case. They asked me to do a lecture about functional emotional developmental capacity 4, and I was really glad to do it. It has occurred to me lately in my travels around the country that there are a lot of people doing developmental models and a lot of people offering certificates in developmental models, and that we need to all get together with the notion that DIR is really based in the relationship-based research that came earlier, decades ago, and that all of us who are doing relationship-based models ought to get together. So I presented to them the boiled down version that I've been thinking about lately. Remember, it's really only my version. It's not representative of other people's position. I certainly believe that we ought to all work together. I think that everybody doing relationship-based models should acknowledge that all of this research was done decades ago, and that there is no reason to trademark or copyright yet another relationship-based developmental model. So if you're going to do research, I would suggest that you say that you're doing a relationship-based model, talk about your protocols, but don't try to trademark human development anymore. It simply holds us back and makes us look less scientific. So as all of you know, I always start any talk that I do about DIR floor time with a picture of Dr. Greenspan, and that's where this lecture actually starts. A presentation about DIR floor time without putting up a picture of the great Stanley Greenspan. And you have to remember that Stanley was a really smart guy and really dogmatic. He had really strong opinions about what to do with kids, but he wasn't alone. I mean, this is a guy who paid attention to what was going on around him and realized, hey, there's already really great developmental stuff going on. Let me just pay attention, put it together, and we'll make an intervention for kids on the autism spectrum that's more respectful, that actually works, and that's developmentally appropriate. So I always want to show Stanley because people just need to remember that Dr. Greenspan was at the heart of all this. Um, so the DIR model, D, developmental, I, individual differences, R, relationship-based. Developmental individual difference relationship-based model, possibly the worst name for a model that has ever existed. Stanley was adamant about it, but I think you could have named it something else and made it more popular just from the jump. So the functional emotional developmental milestones, you all know very well. And I showed them to you just to remind you that that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk a little bit about particularly the juncture that you've identified as being problematic and that I have very strong opinions about. So I think this should be an interesting discussion. So here are the first three milestones. Staying calm and regulated with shared attention. Kids can do that very early on. They sit in their little bumbo seats. They sit in their little high chairs. They're calm. They're available. They're looking at mommy. They're ready. They're just available to be pay attention. And our kids probably are not always at this level. In fact, I would say a lot of our kids, their primary struggles are at this level. But this is something you have to achieve. You have to be available and ready. And that happens 0 to 3 months. Milestone 2, engagement and relatedness. So this is when, children really brighten up and make eye contact and are going, sort of, I'm in it with mommy, I'm here, I'm present. And that happens between 2 and 6 months for neurotypical kids. I have to tell you, I no longer understand what neurotypical even means. I have met such a wide diversity of human beings who have such divergent ways of being in the world that the notion of neurotypicality really doesn't make any sense to me anymore. But I think kids generally make this milestone very early where they're available and they want to be in relationship. You know, human beings want to be in relationship because they have to have relationship to survive. And milestone 3, which is opening and closing simple circles. Now, these first 3 developmental milestones, it is my take on it that these first 3 developmental milestones um, are what most interventions are targeting. They are targeting milestone 1, milestone 2, and milestone 3. And most interventions are targeting them, and they are targeting them for maybe 10 years at a time. And eventually, if you work really hard in another more behaviorally based intervention, you can get a kid to point at things, to sit quietly. They may not be particularly engaged with you, but they will be pointing really actively, and they will be perfectly willing to do stuff like that. So then, and that happens 4 to 9 months. And so then you have the next 2, and those are problem solving, co regulated interactions with a continuous flow, and creative and meaningful use of ideas and words. So 4 is that problem solving, and that's what we wanted to talk about today, I think. And 5 is the beginning of symbolism. And these are Stanley's milestones, right? But if you want to think about Piaget, if you want to think about any other developmentalist, it doesn't really matter. What we're talking about here is the jump to abstraction. And without that jump to abstraction, you're dead in the water. And it really makes a difference in terms of the amount of support that you're going to need in the future. And so my take on this is that the challenge is between those 2 milestones. And if you can get to those 2 milestones, that's where you really start cooking. So if you want to spend your entire career working at milestone 1, 2, and 3, and I think people are very comfortable working at those milestones, you don't need to do DIR. You can do any of the other interventions. All of them will work on those milestones. But if you want people to actually make progress, whether that be young kids or young adults or senior citizens who have developmental challenges, you're going to have to do a relationship based model, and you're going to have to work at getting in a continuous flow. Um, so, milestone 4, which is what we're going to talk about at length today, is problem solving co-regulated interactions with a continuous flow. Kids typically get there by 18 months. So that's an important date, right? 18 months is an important date in the world of autism because that's the date on which people begin to tell you, I first noticed my child was regressing. And they will tell this story. And if you want to read about this, I know not all of you have copies of Respecting Autism, but those of you who do, lend them to other people. Amanda, Respecting Autism is a book I wrote with Stanley. Um, and if you want to read it, that's the story that uh, every single person tells. My child had 200 words. They were doing beautifully. They were paying attention to everything. At 18 months, they began to lose the words, and all of that began to fall away. And very often, as you all know, people attribute that to the MMR vaccine. They attribute it to reaction to that vaccine, and you know that may be true. That's actually possible. It may be the MMR vaccine in some cases. It may be the fact that they just have an environmental overload. It may be that the society has changed so much that it makes it hard for people with challenges to develop that. We don't really care what the cause is, right? None of us in this lonely room in Spokane or in that room in Mississauga care what caused it. What we really care about is that it is an issue of development. So something happened in development, and we're going to address it developmentally and let everybody else in all of the great big autism world fight about what caused it. We don't actually care. but you do hear parents very often say 18 months. And the reason 18 months is important is because, as you can see, it's really an important time in child development. It's important in speech and language. It's important in neural development. So all of those wonderful folks at York will, I'm sure, tell you a lot about that. It's an important time in all kinds of physiological systems and psychological systems. 18 months, that's the key point. Milestone 5, creative and meaningful use of ideas and words. That's where we're beginning to be abstract. And my take on the world of Stanley Greenspan is that if you get to milestone 5, that basically implies milestone 6. And milestone 6 is building logical bridges between ideas. And Stanley, at other points in his career, and I know that in books that have been written, they've parsed this into about 400 different levels. The truth is, for me, if I want to do an intervention in a school, which is what we want to do, right? If I want to do an intervention in the school, I want to parse this down to a much simpler way of thinking. So I want to parse it down to two different levels, right? So I made up a different model as a joke. This is not a model I'm proposing, nor is it a model that I ever intend to make money off of. It's not any idea that I'm ever trying to push on the autism world, but I just think it's amusing. The pragmatic behavior learning in U model. Level 1 is based on Greenspan's, all the first 3 levels of Greenspan. Get the child in a continuous flow, opening and closing circles fluidly around his interests with joy and playfulness. So that's all of DIR boiled down and Floortime boiled down into one sentence. And level 2 is build abstraction through fantasy play, thoughtful language-based conversation with emotionally meaningful why questions, and through musical conversation. And the reason why I tried to make an acronym that matched with the word play is because, as you know, the United Nations High Commission for Human Rights sees play as a right of every child. So they include shelter, food, freedom from fear, and play as rights for children. And it isn't just because play is fun. Play is how children develop. It just is. And so children should be allowed to play, and this model is based in play. I mean, Stanley's model is based in play. Joyful, respectful, rigorous, thinking based, but don't forget the joyful part. This is my favorite picture of joyful.
The entire web meeting was an hour long, and I really only wanted to share a little bit of it with you so you could get a sense of my thinking these days about the DIR floor time model and relationship-based models in general. I was out in Spokane to try to help a group of folks who wanted to do an autistic and ASPE drop-in center and also do community services part of it because they wanted access to the DIR model. It's very difficult to get access to the DIR model if you have limited funds, so I was out there volunteering. Hope you enjoyed the slideshow, and I look forward to posting more of this net meeting at another time.